You're a failure that cannot provide for his family.
My name is Michael Bennett, and for 22 years I thought I understood exactly who I was to my family. I was the guy who fixed the leaky faucet at 11 at night without complaining. I was the one who got up first on Saturday mornings so my wife could sleep in. I was the man whose paycheck landed in our account every other Friday like clockwork, so reliable that none of us ever thought to be grateful for it, the way you never thank your own heartbeat for showing up. I tell you all of that because you need to understand what I lost isn't just a job. It's the only version of myself I ever knew how to be. And 3 months after that version disappeared, my wife Sarah sat across from me at our kitchen table, looked me dead in the eyes, and called me a failure. She looked at me, really looked at me, the way you look at someone you've decided you no longer respect, and she said one word, failure. She didn't scream it. She wasn't crying when she said it. It came out flat, almost gentle, like she was reading a fact off a piece of paper that had been sitting in front of her for weeks and she was just now getting around to saying it out loud. And here's the part I still can't fully explain to people. In that exact moment, sitting across from the woman I'd loved since I was 26 years old, I didn't argue with her. I didn't defend myself. I agreed with her. Because for 3 months, in the quiet hours before she woke up, I had been calling myself the exact same thing. What she didn't know, what I hadn't told her, and what I had no plan to tell her that night, was that 4 days before she said that word, I had already made a decision. A decision that would either be the smartest thing I ever did for this family, or the final nail in a marriage that was already splintering under the weight of unpaid bills and unanswered emails. She had no idea what I'd been doing with my mornings for the past several weeks. She had no idea what was sitting in a folder on my laptop, hidden behind a spreadsheet labeled job applications that I hadn't updated in 11 days. She thought she was looking at a man who had given up. What she was actually looking at was a man who had stopped asking permission to try. I need you to sit with that word for a second the way I had to sit with it. Failure, not because it was cruel, because it was accurate, or at least it felt accurate, standing in the wreckage of a life I used to be proud of. I had built spreadsheets tracking 60, then 80, then over 100 job applications with nothing coming back but automated rejection emails and silence. I had watched our savings account, the one we'd built for 12 years, shrink by the week. I had started parking 2 blocks from the unemployment office so none of our neighbors would see my truck there. If you have never lost the thing that made you feel like a man worth marrying, I hope you never have to learn what I learned in those 3 months. But if you have, you already know exactly the silence I'm talking about. Here's what makes this story different from every other one you've watched about a marriage falling apart after a layoff. This isn't a story about a man who gave up and a woman who left. It's not that simple, and honestly I wish it were, because simple stories don't keep you up at night the way this one still does. 6 weeks after that word landed on me like a verdict, Sarah found out the truth about what I'd actually been doing with my days. And when she found out, she didn't apologize for calling me a failure. She didn't need to. What happened in the 6 weeks between that kitchen table and the moment the truth came out changed both of us in ways neither one of us saw coming. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why she said what she said, and exactly what I was hiding from the woman I loved. Before we go any further into how we got to that kitchen table, and what I was really doing behind her back for those 3 months, let us know in the comments where you're watching this from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. There's a version of this story where the layoff is the worst thing that ever happens to Sarah and me. I want to tell you right now plainly that it isn't. The layoff was only the first domino. What came after it, the silence, the secret, the 6 weeks she spent not knowing what her own husband was building 40 minutes from our house, that's the part of this story that actually tested whether 22 years of marriage meant anything at all. Because here's the question I want you holding on to as we go back to where this really started. Was Sarah wrong to call me a failure that night? Or did she say the one true thing that finally forced me to stop hiding and start fighting for this family the way I should have from the very beginning? To understand how Sarah and I ended up sitting across from each other at that kitchen table, you have to go back 17 years, to a version of me that barely resembles the man who stopped applying for jobs. Back then I was 29 years old, working my way up at a mid-sized manufacturing company outside Columbus, Ohio, and I was the guy people described as steady. Not flashy, not the smartest guy in any room, but steady. The kind of man who showed up early, stayed late when it mattered, and never once called in sick without a genuinely good reason. My supervisor used to joke that you could set your watch by me. I liked being that guy. I liked it so much that somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to, I let that reliability become the entire foundation of how I saw myself as a husband and a father. Sarah wasn't looking for a provider when she agreed to marry me. That part matters, and I need you to hold on to it, because it changes everything about how you should understand what she said to me at that table years later. She grew up the daughter of a man who worked constantly and was never home, a father who mistook a paycheck for presents, and she told me early in our relationship that she never wanted a marriage built that way. She wanted a partner, someone who noticed when she was tired. Someone who showed up to the small, unglamorous moments, not just the big ones. She was working nights as a labor and delivery nurse when we met, exhausted half the time we were together, and she never once made me feel like her exhaustion was my job to fix. She just wanted me next to her in it. We got married when I was 28 and she was 26, in a small ceremony at her parents' church with maybe 60 people in the pews, and neither of us had any illusions that it was going to be some fairy tale. We built something ordinary and steady instead, which at the time felt like the better trade. 2 kids came along over the next several years, our son Ryan and our daughter Grace, and we settled into a house on the edge of town that we were 3 years from paying off completely. Sunday dinners at her parents' place, Ryan's baseball games on Saturday mornings, Grace's endless questions about everything, the kind of questions that make you feel simultaneously exhausted and completely in love with your own child. None of it was extraordinary, all of it was ours. I want to be honest with you about something, because this story only means anything if I'm honest. There's a version of me back then who quietly built his entire sense of worth on being the one who never let this family down financially. I didn't examine that. I didn't question it. I just noticed that every time I brought home a bonus or got a raise or paid off the minivan a year early, something in my chest would settle in a way I couldn't fully name. I thought that feeling was pride. Looking back now, I think it was closer to fear, dressed up as pride. The fear of a man who had quietly decided his value to his own family was conditional on a number showing up in a bank account every 2 weeks. Sarah noticed things about me that I didn't notice about myself. She used to tell me, usually late at night after the kids were asleep, that she worried I only let myself feel proud of myself on payday. I'd laugh it off. I'd tell her she was overthinking it, that a man is supposed to provide, that's just what the job is. She'd get quiet after I said things like that, the particular kind of quiet she got when she decided arguing further wasn't going to change my mind. I didn't understand back then that she wasn't criticizing me. She was warning me. She could see something coming toward our marriage long before I could, the way people who love you sometimes see the shape of your worst fear before you're willing to admit you have one. By the time our 17th year of marriage rolled around, we had built a life that, on paper, looked almost boring in its stability. Steady mortgage payments, a minivan and a truck, both paid off. Grace was 10 and obsessed with soccer. Ryan was 14 and had just started asking us if he could get a part-time job at the hardware store down the road, which made me proud in a way I didn't fully understand until I lost my own. Sarah had moved from bedside nursing into a supervisory role at the hospital, still exhausted but proud of the work in a different way now. We weren't wealthy, we weren't anything close to it. But we had built something that felt to both of us like it was supposed to last. I want you to remember that feeling because it's the exact thing that got put on trial over the next 3 months. I've thought a lot in the time since about whether there were warning signs I missed, small cracks in the foundation that I was too comfortable to notice. And the honest answer is yes, there were. Sarah had started saying things, small offhand comments about wanting me to have interests outside of work, about wanting our identity as a couple to be built on more than just my job title and her job title. I brushed those comments aside the way you brush aside a check engine light when the car still seems to be running fine. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find out exactly how much of my identity really was riding on that job, and exactly how unprepared I was for what would happen to me, and to us, the day it disappeared. It happened on a Tuesday in March, which is a detail I remember with a strange, almost embarrassing amount of clarity, because Tuesdays had never meant anything to me before that day. I'd worked at that company for 17 years. I started as a floor technician and worked my way up to production supervisor, the kind of promotion that happens slowly year over year, until one day you look up and realize you're the guy training the new hires instead of being one. I had a photo of Sarah and the kids taped inside my locker. I had a coffee mug on my desk that Ryan made me in 3rd grade, chipped on one side that I refused to throw away. None of that mattered when I got the calendar invite that morning with no subject line, just my name, HR, and my direct supervisor. The meeting lasted 4 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock on the wall behind my supervisor's head the entire time, watching the second hand move, because I couldn't make myself look at his face, while he explained that my position, along with 41 others, was being eliminated as part of a restructuring that had apparently been discussed for months at a level I was never part of. 17 years, and it ended in 4 minutes with a folder of severance paperwork and a box for my desk items that I never actually used. I left that mug behind. I left the photo of my family behind too, and I still can't fully explain why, except that some part of me felt like I didn't deserve to walk out with it that day. I drove home with the radio off, which if you know me, you know is not normal. I like noise. I like talk radio, sports commentary, anything to fill a quiet car. That day I drove in complete silence for 40 minutes, rehearsing how I was going to tell Sarah, and every version I came up with in my head sounded like an apology instead of an explanation. When I got home, she was still in her scrubs from a 12-hour shift, and I told her everything, sitting right there in the kitchen before she'd even had a chance to sit down. She didn't panic. I want to be clear about that because it matters for what happened later. Her first response wasn't fear. It was her hand on my arm and her voice, steady, telling me we were going to figure this out together. The first month after the layoff, honestly, things were almost fine. Better than fine if I'm being completely honest with you. I sent out 60 applications in those first 4 weeks, updating my resume every few days, staying on top of every job board I could find. Sarah picked up extra shifts at the hospital without a single complaint, and some nights we'd sit up late making lists of places I hadn't applied to yet, treating the whole thing like a project we were tackling as a team. We told the kids it was a rough patch, the kind every family goes through sometimes, and rough patches end. I believed that completely. I think Sarah believed it too. 60 applications and not one single callback should have worried me more than it did, but I was still running on hope at that point, and hope is a strange kind of fuel that burns hot before it burns out. The second month is when the tone in our house started to change, though not in the way you'd expect. There weren't arguments. If anything, I wish there had been arguments, because at least an argument means two people are still actively engaged with each other's pain. Instead, there was silence, a specific kind of silence that creeps into a marriage when both people are scared, and neither one wants to say the scary thing out loud. Sarah stopped asking me every evening how the job search was going. I told myself she was just being considerate, giving me space. Looking back, I think she'd started to notice the same thing I was starting to feel but refusing to say, which was that 80 applications in, the silence coming back from employers was starting to feel less like bad luck and more like a verdict on who I was. By the third month, something had shifted in me that I didn't tell Sarah about, and this is the part of the story where I have to be honest about a decision that changed everything for better and for worse. 4 days before that night at the kitchen table, I stopped applying for jobs entirely. Not because I'd given up, though I understand completely why it looked that way from the outside. I'd sent out over 100 applications by that point, for supervisor roles nearly identical to the one I'd held for years, and I'd started to notice a pattern that felt less like bad luck and more like the industry quietly telling a man in his late 40s that his experience wasn't worth what he thought it was. Somewhere in that third month, an old idea I'd buried years earlier, one I'd never told Sarah I still thought about, started to feel less like a fantasy and more like the only door still open to me. I kept leaving the house every morning at 7:15, the same time I always had, and coming home at 5:30, the same time I always had, so that from Sarah's side of things, nothing about my routine looked different. What she didn't know was that I wasn't driving to interviews anymore. I want you to hold that detail because it's going to matter enormously in a few minutes. For now, all you need to understand is that somewhere in those last 2 weeks before the word failure ever left her mouth, I had already quietly stopped fighting for a job that no longer existed, and started fighting in complete secrecy, for something I was terrified to tell her about because I'd failed at something like it once before, early in our marriage, and I couldn't bear the thought of watching her face fall a second time. The night it finally broke came after the kids were asleep. Bills spread across the kitchen table and stacks Sarah had started organizing by due date, a habit that told me more about her stress level than any conversation could have. She looked at those stacks, then she looked at me and she asked the question she'd clearly been swallowing for weeks. What have you even been doing all day? I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like a confession or a lie, and in that split second I chose silence over both. That silence is what made her say the word, not cruelty, not disrespect. 3 months of watching the man she married go quiet in a way she'd never seen before, and one final silence that told her, in the absence of any other explanation, that maybe he really had given up. She didn't leave that night. I want to say that clearly right at the start of this part of the story because I know some of you watching are bracing for the moment she walks out the door with a suitcase, and that's not what happened. What happened instead was quieter and in some ways harder to live through. For the next 10 days, Sarah and I became two people sharing a mortgage and a set of children instead of two people sharing a marriage. We spoke in logistics, who was picking Grace up from soccer. Whether Ryan had turned in his permission slip, neither of us said the word failure again, but it sat in that kitchen with us every single morning like a third person nobody wanted to acknowledge. I started sleeping on the couch during that stretch, not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't bring myself to lie next to her and pretend the silence between us was normal. Some nights I'd hear her moving around upstairs long after the house had gone quiet, and I knew she wasn't sleeping either. We were two exhausted people circling the same wound from opposite sides of the house. both convinced that saying anything else out loud would only make things worse. I want to be honest about something here because it matters for understanding what came next. During those 10 days, some of the people who knew us started forming their own theories about what was happening to our marriage, and not all of those theories were kind. A couple of Sarah's coworkers at the hospital, women who'd known us for years, started asking her carefully worded questions that all seemed to circle the same suspicion. Was I really job hunting during the day, or was something else going on? One of them gently asked if she thought there might be someone else, some reason I'd become so evasive about where my hours were going. Sarah told me later that she dismissed the idea outright at first, but that as the days stretched on and my explanations stayed vague, a small, ugly seed of doubt had started to take root in the back of her mind. I understand why. From where she was standing, a man who leaves the house every morning and comes home every evening but has nothing to show for it and nothing to say about it doesn't look like a man job hunting. He looks like a man hiding something. The truth started to surface almost by accident, in the way truth often does in families, through a child who wasn't trying to reveal anything at all. Grace mentioned, completely offhand over dinner one night, that Daddy had picked her up early from school twice that month, and not from anywhere near his usual route home. She described a building with no sign on it, out past the old shopping plaza on Route 9, the one that used to have a hardware store in it years ago before it closed down. Sarah didn't say anything at the table. She told me later she just filed it away, the way you file away a detail that doesn't quite fit the story you've been telling yourself, and she started paying closer attention after that. 3 days later, she followed me. She's never been someone who does things like that, and she told me afterward how strange it felt, sitting in her car 2 blocks from that plaza, watching my truck pull into a parking lot in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when I was supposed to be at an interview I'd told her about that morning. She watched me get out, unlock a door to a unit with paper still taped over the windows, and disappear inside. She sat there for almost 20 minutes deciding whether to follow me in, replaying every version of what she might find, and she told me later that somewhere in those 20 minutes, she had genuinely convinced herself she might be about to catch her husband in an affair. What she found instead, when she finally worked up the nerve to walk up and look through a gap in the paper covering the window, was a man on his knees in the middle of an empty commercial space, surrounded by sawdust, hand tools laid out across a folding table, and a single work light clipped to a ladder in the corner. Not another woman, not a secret life falling apart. Just me alone, in a space I'd told absolutely no one about, doing something I hadn't done in years and had convinced myself I no longer had any right to attempt. She stood outside that window for a long time before she ever knocked, and when I finally opened that door and saw her standing there, I knew immediately that 3 months of careful silence were about to collapse in on themselves. I'm not going to pretend that moment felt like relief, even though some part of me had been dreading and craving it in equal measure for weeks. Her face wasn't angry. It was something closer to stunned, the particular expression of someone trying to reconcile 2 completely different stories about the same person at the same time. She didn't ask me what I was doing there, not at first. She just looked around that half-finished space, at the tools I'd been quietly buying with money I hadn't told her about, and asked me one question, quiet and even the same tone she'd used the night she called me a failure. How long has this been going on, Michael? And I understood, standing there covered in sawdust in front of my own wife, that whatever I said next was going to determine whether we survived this or not. I told her everything, standing right there in that half-finished space with sawdust still on my hands, because there was nothing left to protect by staying quiet. For 3 months, every single time I told her I had an interview, I had actually been driving to that empty unit on Route 9. I had taken almost all of what remained of our savings, money she believed was untouched and sitting safely in our account as a cushion against everything else falling apart, and I had signed a lease on that space without telling her a single word about it. I was using it to quietly start building the thing I had wanted to build for over a decade and had never once had the courage to attempt. A small repair and contracting business of my own, the kind of thing my old company used to joke could never survive outside the structure of a big employer. I want to explain why I hid it because I know from where you're sitting, hiding something like that from your own wife sounds indefensible, and for a long time I would have agreed with you. Early in our marriage, back when Sarah and I were still finding our footing, I had tried something similar. A small side venture doing repair work for neighbors and friends of friends, nothing as serious as what I was building this time, but serious enough that when it fell apart within a year, I watched her face change in a way I never wanted to see again. I watched her go from believing in me to quietly recalculating what she could count on. I told myself back then that I would never put that expression on her face a second time. What I actually did, without ever admitting it to myself, was decide that the safest way to protect her from that disappointment was to never let her see me try again until I already knew whether I'd succeeded. Here's the part of this story I still find hardest to say out loud, even now. The word she used at that kitchen table, failure, wasn't cruel to me because it was wrong. It cut so deep because for weeks, alone in that unit at 6 in the morning before the sun came up, I had already been whispering some version of that same word to myself. I told myself over 100 rejected applications was proof that I no longer had anything of value to offer anyone. I told myself that trying to build something of my own at 47 years old with a mortgage and 2 kids depending on me was the kind of reckless decision only a man who had already failed at everything else would make. Sarah didn't introduce that fear into our marriage that night. She just accidentally said the exact sentence I'd already been carrying around in my own chest for 3 months, and hearing it out loud from her mouth instead of my own head was the thing that finally broke something open in me. Standing in that unit, I told her all of it. The old failed venture from years earlier that I'd never fully let go of. The specific afternoon, 4 days before she called me a failure, when I decided to stop applying to jobs that clearly weren't going to call me back and instead sign a lease with money I should have asked her about first. I told her about the folder on my laptop labeled job applications, the one she'd glanced at more than once over dinner, believing it was proof I was still searching, when really it had become the place I hid the business plan I was too afraid to show her. I told her I was sorry not for trying to build something, but for deciding all on my own that she didn't deserve to be part of that decision from the very beginning. She didn't respond the way I expected. I braced myself for anger, for the kind of hurt that comes from being deceived by someone you trust completely, and there was some of that I won't pretend there wasn't. But underneath the anger was something that landed even harder because it was so much more honest. She told me she didn't feel betrayed so much as she felt shut out. She said she hadn't married a man who needed to be perfect in front of her. She'd married a man she expected to let her stand next to him when things got hard, the same way she'd stood next to him through nursing school, through 2 difficult pregnancies, through every ordinary crisis a marriage accumulates over 2 decades. And instead, she said, I had made a decision that could sink our entire family, completely alone, without giving her the chance to be scared alongside me, or hopeful alongside me, or anything alongside me at all. I didn't have a good answer for her in that moment, and I'm not going to pretend I found some perfect sentence that fixed everything right there in that unit. What I told her, the only honest thing I had left, was that I was more afraid of failing in front of her a second time than I was of failing altogether. She was quiet for a long time after I said that. Then she walked further into that unfinished space, ran her hand along the folding table covered in tools I'd bought with money that used to be ours, and asked me one more question. Not whether I'd forgive myself for hiding it, whether I was going to let her actually be part of it now, or whether I was planning on hiding the failures of this business from her too, the same way I'd hidden everything else. That question changed the entire direction of what happened next, both for the business sitting unfinished in that unit, and for a marriage that was still very much undecided in that moment. 3 days after that conversation in the unit, my phone rang while I was standing in the driveway loading tools into my truck, and it was a number I didn't recognize. A man named Gary, who I'd fixed a broken fence for as a favor almost 2 years earlier, back before any of this started, was calling because his neighbor needed a full deck rebuilt and he'd remembered my work. I almost let it go to voicemail out of habit, still half convinced that nothing good was going to come out of that phone for a while longer. I'm glad I didn't. That one phone call turned into a job, and that job turned into a conversation with the neighbor's brother-in-law, who needed a bathroom redoled, and within 2 weeks I had more work sitting in front of me than I'd had in the previous 3 months combined. I wish I could tell you it was some dramatic overnight transformation, the kind you see in movies where a man's fortunes flip in a single triumphant scene, but that's not honest, and I promised you honesty from the start of this. It was slower than that and harder than that. Some weeks were still tight. There were nights I sat at that same kitchen table doing math on a piece of paper, trying to figure out whether a materials cost was going to eat an entire week's profit. But within 6 weeks of that conversation with Sarah in the unit, I wasn't behind on the mortgage anymore. I had hired my first employee, a younger guy named Tyler who'd been laid off from a construction firm the year before and needed steady work just as badly as I once did. For the first time in months, I went to bed some nights actually looking forward to the next morning instead of dreading it. Here's what actually shocked Sarah though, and it wasn't the money, even though the money mattered plenty to a family that had been counting every dollar for months. What shocked her was slower to arrive and much harder to explain to people who ask us about the story now. It was the realization that the man she had called a failure at that kitchen table had never actually stopped fighting for this family, not for one single day of those 3 months. He had just stopped believing he was allowed to fail in front of her while he did it. She told me months later that the hardest part of processing everything wasn't forgiving me for the secrecy. It was sitting with the uncomfortable question of whether her own fear, her own understandable panic about our finances, had made it harder for me to be honest with her in the first place. I don't think either of us has a clean answer to that question, even now, and I've stopped expecting one. What I do know is that Sarah started coming by the unit some evenings after her shifts at the hospital, sitting on an overturned bucket while I finished a project, asking real questions about the business instead of anxious ones about money. She helped me set up a simple bookkeeping system on her nights off, the kind of unglamorous partnership neither of us had pictured when we said our vows 22 years earlier, but exactly the kind of partnership she'd told me back when we first met that she actually wanted all along. Somewhere in those evenings on that bucket watching me work, she stopped being the woman who found out about a secret and started being the woman who helped build what came after it. We are not the same couple who sat at that kitchen table 3 months earlier, and I don't think we ever will be again in the best possible sense of that sentence. We are more honest with each other now, sometimes in ways that are still uncomfortable, because honesty after a secret that big doesn't arrive gently. I tell her the bad days now, not just the good ones. If a client cancels a job or a material cost runs over budget, she hears about it the same day, not 3 weeks later buried behind a spreadsheet with the wrong label on it. She's learned that asking me directly what I'm not telling her is often kinder, for both of us, than assuming the worst and carrying that fear alone the way she did during those 10 silent days. She has never once apologized for calling me a failure that night, and here's the thing I want you to understand clearly before we close this out. She didn't need to. I've made my peace with that word in a way I never expected to. Some mornings, driving to a job site in a truck that has our business name painted on the side of it now, I think about that word and I don't feel the sting I used to feel. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds, because that word was the thing that finally forced a silence I'd been hiding behind for 3 months to break wide open. Every morning she hands me a cup of coffee before I leave for the shop we built together, without either of us saying anything about it, feels like the only apology either of us ever needed. So here are the two questions I want to leave you with, the ones Sarah and I still don't fully agree on when we talk about this story late at night. Would you have told your spouse the truth from day one, the moment you started building something uncertain, even knowing it might scare them? Or did I do the right thing protecting her from the risk until I knew whether it would actually work? And was Sarah wrong to say what she said that night at our kitchen table, or was that one word, however painful, exactly the wake-up call I needed to stop hiding and start fighting for this family the way I should have been all along?